court, a magistrate decided to postpone an application involving a child who had committed an act of violence against another child. I mean, talking, of course, about the case in which Lefuna Mavunga was the victim. Well, the magistrate postponing that case today, and that comes after Lefuna took her own life, it seems, following that assault. Now, the person who is accused is just 14 years old. It appears it was the assault and the fact that no one helped Lefuna that led to her taking her own life last week. Dr. Joan Van Niekerk is a child rights and protection consultant. She joins us now. Dr. Van Niekerk, good afternoon to you. The crime statistics that I've seen for the last financial year seem to show that there were at least 700 incidents of children attacking children. These were cases reported to the police, so I presume that they were quite serious. That seems to be a very high number.
In fact, if you look at the 2020 report of the Department of Justice on crimes committed by children, certainly the number of crimes appears to be a lot higher. Even though if you look at this in terms of preceding years, there has been some decline in child-on-child crimes. So it's actually, quite concerning that the numbers remain high. There is a slight decrease, but of course we do not have yet the 2020-2021 figures from the Department of Justice. Certainly those of us who work in the child rights field are very, very concerned about child-on-child violence, but equally as concerned, in fact probably more concerned about adult-on-child violence or adults being violent with each other in front of children, because this models violence as a way of dealing with interpersonal issues to children. And so it's not surprising that children, when they get into some kind of spat with another child, may respond by being violent towards that child. Or if the child themselves is feeling uncomfortable about the situation they are in, it might be taken out on another child in order to just try and make oneself feel more powerful or better. So the situation as far as child rights activists are concerned is very, very serious. But my call in terms of prevention is to say to adults in the world of children, please raise your children without violence, and that means discipline appropriately, but also raise your children without exposing them to violence. Be aware of what they're watching on TV. Be aware of how you interact with your partner. Be aware of what your child is exposed to at school. Make sure your child's school has an anti-bullying policy that is not just a piece of paper, but is in actual fact a meaningful document that is implemented throughout the school.
I mean, it seems to be this really vicious cycle. You know, adults are violent to each other. I mean, we see it in news reports. I mean, the conversations I've been involved in, do we show this? How do you tell a story if you don't show that, you know? All of these things are very, very complicated. So it's about, I suppose, you're the expert, not me, it's about breaking that cycle. Now, I mean, I've seen some people who say that if you're able to break the cycle at school, maybe the next generation of adults will be better than my generation of adults. On the other hand, if my generation of adults is still behaving violently in front of the current generation of children, the cycle just continues.
It does indeed. And this is why I believe the exposure to children in the home to violence is our greatest concern, because this usually happens when a child is in violence. And this is really quite traumatic, because this is when children are taken on as role models for behavior. Waiting until a child is too late. Obviously, non-violent behavior, if it's problem solving, education, through conflict, at home, that learning is taken in the school environment, and then the school reinforces those messages. I agree with you about the news, and one of the things that I think is really important is that children should be exposed to the news, but in the company of a caring adult who can explain to the child what they're seeing it, why they're seeing it, and how unacceptable it is. The other thing I want to say is children who are violent towards each other are sometimes violent towards animals that they come across as well. So violence not just to people, but also violence to animals is something we should be looking at as well. I think veterinary surgeons, when they are treating an animal that has been treated violently, need to make sure that that is reported to Child Protection Services. Because if that happens under the supervision or under the eye or awareness of an adult, that is equally, to me, as habit forming as exposure to violence in the home.
This is an impossible question to answer, but can you look at levels of violence in our society among adults now and make a prediction about the future? And I realize that every single case, every child has a different experience of growing up. I understand that in some cases, you know, some children come from very, very difficult backgrounds and yet are able to overcome that, and other children just cannot. And some people come from very, very well-resourced backgrounds and still emerge violently. I mean, you know, there's a whole conversation to have around nature and nurture here. But I mean, if we look at the violence, the numbers that we see now of children attacking children, do you expect then that the levels of violence among South African adults will remain as it is now?
Well, I guess it will. And this is why I think people who work in my field and on domestic violence issues are very, very concerned. And we cannot bring the message home as strongly as is necessary. I wish more television interviewers would have this kind of conversation, Stephen, because I think that it's a kind of situation that brings the conversation back into the home. But there is one thing that perhaps is not well known that needs to be talked about more. Children who are exposed to violence in the home from a very young age not only suffer in terms of learned behavior that can get them into a lot of trouble later on in their lives when they're at school or even as adults, but it also impacts on the brain development of children, because children are in a constant state of anxiety. That anxiety releases certain hormones, and those obviously move into the brain structure as well. And research is giving us more and more information about exposure to violence and the impact on the developing brain. So we're not just looking at emulated behavior or learned behavior. We're looking at the structure of the brain, and the part that is most affected is the part of the brain that is involved in decision-making, impulse control. So we have to see exposure to violence among children as something that is certainly, it cuts in two ways. It impacts on children's behavior in two ways. So we need to make sure that we get the message across now.
Dr. Joan Van Niekerk, thank you. Child rights and protection consultant. Really do appreciate the time. It's a terrible story. It's a terrible cycle, one that we really, as a society, need to work on breaking. Well,